All right, well, I'm very honored here as we continue the coverage of the loss of Pope Francis to welcome papal expert Dr. Daniel Cosacchi of the University of Scranton. You're the Vice President for Mission and Ministry at University of Scranton. Thanks for joining me, Dr. Cosacchi.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, you've written extensively about Pope Francis and, 12-year reign. First of all, what was your takeaway from this 12 years of his papacy?
Wow. Um, I think that Pope Francis's legacy over these 12 years has really been remarkable in so many ways. First of all, he was the Pope of firsts, as many people have been saying. He was the first Pope to take the name Francis. After Saint Francis of Assisi. Remember when he was elected and took the name Francis, originally people were thinking, "Oh my goodness, he's a Jesuit, so he probably took the name after Francis Xavier, one of the original Jesuits and a great missionary to Asia." 2 days after he was elected, Francis met with the media representatives and said that he took the name after Francis of Assisi for three reasons. So not Xavier, but Assisi. And first of all, because Francis of Assisi was the saint of the poor, and Pope Francis wanted a poor church for the poor. Secondly, St. Francis of Assisi was the saint of peace, and Pope Francis wanted peace. And in fact, said that every week, Sunday after Sunday, in his Angelus address, peace in the world, calling for ceasefires in Ukraine and in the Holy Land.
And he actually did that in his final message on Sunday.
Exactly right. So really in keeping with his tradition. And thirdly, St. Francis was the saint of all of creation. We always see statues of St. Francis with animals. Well, that's really part of St. Francis being the saint of all of creation. So 10 years ago now, Pope Francis wrote an encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. And so that was really part of his message. So that was the first person to take the name Francis. As I mentioned, he was a Jesuit, so he was the first Jesuit pope. The Society of
Now, I was
Jesus.
gonna ask you this, if they
Yeah.
decide to make him a saint, does he become Saint Francis the Second, or how does that work? I mean, how many Saint Francis are there?
Well, there's a few. So we've obviously St. Francis of Assisi and St. Francis Xavier, who I've already mentioned, but there's a few other Saint Francis's. So St. Francis de Sales would be another popular one, and St. Francis Borgia, who was also a Jesuit. So if one day, God willing, Pope Francis becomes Pope Saint Francis, he would join a long list of really saintly figures that the Church already prays for their intercession. So I think that would be apt. I don't want to put the cart in front of the horse or anything like that,
Now, let
but I
me ask you this: this loss seems to have hurt a lot of people inside, outside the church community, which is great how he had that reach inside and outside the Catholic Church. But beyond that, I feel like his loss is hurting a lot of people more so than Pope John Paul II and even Benedict, because he retired before he passed away. So, what's this uniqueness to this Pope that everybody's really rallying around when they're mourning him?
it's fascinating because I believe that, well, certainly not just I believe, but we see that every pope has his own style. So if we just think about the three popes that you just mentioned, John Paul II was this big charismatic figure. He could have 1 million people, tuning in to his every word, and he was like an actor. In fact, he was an actor, and so he was full of charisma. Benedict XVI was a bit more cerebral and intellectual. He was a university professor, and so he was a little bit more reserved in that sense, and as you say, died long after he resigned the papacy. So that was a little bit different. With Francis, I feel like he had a particular gift that I've seen with very few people, where he could reach out to, there could be 1 million people there, as there often were. Think about his trip to the Philippines a few years back, where there were, in fact, over 1 million people present. And you got the sense when he was speaking that he was speaking directly to you, that even if you were watching him from thousands of miles away in a different language through the translator, that he was looking right at you and he was reaching out right to you, because he recognized, like any good father does, that the people in greatest need are the ones that we need to attend to. And so I think that personal touch that he had really impacted people in a great way. And I think we're going to see that outpouring of love for him over these next days.
We'll get to the next few days from your perspective in a minute, but because you are director of ministry and whatnot at Scranton University, I want to ask you this. I'm imagining you are a married man as well. Is that correct?
I am, yeah.
I bring that up because he did one of the biggest reforms I thought was allowing men to marry in the priesthood. I feel like that is such an important point. No one really covered, but it would help alleviate a lot of issues in the Catholic Church. Am I right?
Well, so let me I'm just going to pump the brakes a little bit there. So there's still in the Roman Catholic priesthood the expectation of celibacy, so that the vast majority, like 99% of Catholic priests, aren't able to be married. So there's one sort of carve out exception for that, and it is that that priests who converted from the Anglican Church, who were ministers in the Anglican Church and are already married and then converted, can be priests in the Catholic Church. So that's still an open topic, Alex, that a lot of people are going to be asking about in the coming days. Will the next pope do anything about mandatory celibacy for men who are priests, and perhaps want to be married, or married men who perhaps want to be priests? And obviously the other question is women, and the possible question of ordination for them. But so still there's, I would say, a growing edge there. Whether or not the next pope acts on that, I don't know, but it's certainly a conversation topic.
By the way, your book is called Great American Prophets, Pope Francis and Models of Christian Life. And this is the other thing. I feel like as Christians, you don't really you think about the Catholic Church, but it doesn't ingratiate your life. Yet here, do you find Christians and Catholics are mourning Pope Francis today?
I do. Um, I certainly get the sense, both locally here in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where I am, northeastern Pennsylvania, which is historically a pretty Catholic region. I'm not a native of here. I moved here, so I'm sort of still learning as I go. But also, just looking at the news from around the country and indeed from around the world, there is an outpouring of support, not just from Catholics, not just from other Christian denominations, not just even from other people of faith, like many faithful Jews and Muslims and Hindus and whatnot, but even from agnostics and atheists who looked at Pope Francis and said, "Okay, I don't believe what he believes about God and about Jesus and about the church, and yet I can appreciate what this man stands for." There are so many people who can look at him, or looked at him in his life and said, he stands for the common good for all. He stands for outreach to the poor and the people on the margins. He stands for peace in the world. Whether you believe in God or not, it's a good thing to stand for peace in the world and to stand for civility, which we're lacking in a lot of ways. So I think Pope Francis was, in many senses, the conscience of the world.
Now, you are VP of mission as well. So did you ever get any missions out to the Vatican, or has your time at Scranton or in this field as in the ministry taken you to the Vatican at all?
I've been to the Vatican twice. Once here with the people at the University of Scranton, with some members of our wonderful board of trustees, and once on my honeymoon, as a matter of fact. My wife and I went there in 2015, and we saw Pope Francis during one of the general audiences with thousands of other people. And we're going back. A group of faculty and staff will be heading to Rome this June. And as you may know, this is part of what the church calls a jubilee year. So every 25 years, the church celebrates a jubilee year. And in fact, Pope Francis, so those are called ordinary jubilees. So at the turn of the century, 25, 50, 75. Every 25 is an ordinary jubilee. But then a number of years ago, 2016, Pope Francis called an extraordinary jubilee. That year, the theme was mercy. This year, the theme is hope. And I hate to reduce any papacy to one or two words, but if I were, those would be two great words, because in many ways he was the Pope of Mercy. There was a big editorial on the Vatican News website yesterday calling him the Pope of Mercy. And so this year, every year we do a pilgrimage to Rome with faculty and staff. This year, we're doing it in this Jubilee year of hope. And so by the time we're there in June, there in all likelihood will be a new pope, unless we have a historically long conclave on our hands. But we look forward to greeting the new pope, whoever he is, and we pledge whoever that is our prayers and our loyalty. But it's always good to be in Rome, because in a lot of ways that's sort of home base, headquarters of the church. So over the next few weeks, all these events that we're going to see sort of unfolding in Rome is going to be like a homecoming for Catholics, even if we're watching it on TV.
I'm so glad, by the way, in your book, and we'll get to the length of the next pope because I think they're going to pick someone a little older. Actually, believe it or not, it might be an 80-year-old that becomes pope. We'll have to see if that actually happens.
Yep.
But because we've seen a 27-year run by Pope John Paul II and a 12-year run, and Benedict had what about a, I would say a
Benedict was
10-year
eight
run
years.
or something
Eight
like
years.
that. 8 years. So
Yep.
it's been a wide range in my lifetime of different runs here. So we'll have to see. But I'm so glad you mentioned in your book the 2015 trip by Pope Francis to the United States. Is it me, or was he treated like a rock star when he came to America? I felt like it was sort of like the Beatles. I hate to say it to compare it, but it felt like a rock star hit our soil.
Well, I mean, he had mass in Madison Square Garden. What do you want? I mean, he was right where Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were, were playing. The Pope celebrated the Eucharist. So no, but seriously, I think Alex, in one sense, he's treated like a rock star. He was treated like a rock star wherever he went. But we sort of, being in the United States, we're tuned into how it happens here. And I mean, the book that I wrote was really focused, had as its genesis the historic address to Congress, the joint session of Congress that he delivered. And in that address, so a pope has never done that before. In that address, he named what he called four great Americans, or four historic Americans, two of whom we were all pretty familiar with. Most Americans are pretty familiar with Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. But the other two that he named were Catholic figures, namely Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. And they were two of the most important American Catholics of the 20th century. Dorothy Day was the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, and her cause for canonization to become a saint is currently ongoing in Rome. Pope Francis was a supporter of that. But the Catholic Worker Movement is about enacting the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. So when I say that, what do I mean? I mean feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, visiting the sick and the imprisoned, clothing the naked, burying the dead. That's what the Catholic worker was and remains all about. And Thomas Merton was an associate of Dorothy Day's. He was both of them were sort of converts to Catholicism, and Thomas Merton went from being sort of this party animal type of figure to a contemplative monk, became a Benedictine monk, and he wrote one of the best-selling religious books of the 20th century, The Seven-Story Mountain. And Dorothy Day wrote another best-selling book, The Long Loneliness, really talking about their journeys. So Pope Francis named these four great Americans, and what I tried to do in the book was say that really what binds them together is a particular blueprint that Pope Francis saw as important in becoming a good person. Not just for Christians, not just for Catholics, but all people of goodwill can follow in the footsteps of these four great Americans and say, I'm going to be in solidarity with the poor. I'm going to work for racial justice. I'm going to work for interreligious dialogue. Whatever the case may be, they have some sense of being models for us.
Anything that my listeners at One Leg Up with Alex Garrett can do to help get this canonization happening for Dorothy Day? It sounds like she was quite the role model.
I think the best thing that we can all do is pray. Even if, and see, this is even if you're not a person of faith, you can send good wishes that this would happen. Pope Francis always said that whenever he was addressing, Catholics and other people of no faith tradition, he would say, please, almost every time he spoke, he said, please don't forget to pray for me. And then if there were other people there, he would always say, and if you're not a person of faith, send good thoughts. So if you're a person of faith, pray for Dorothy Day's canonization. Pray that the next pope will continue to move this forward. Pray for Dorothy Day's intercession. She happens to be a particular favorite saint of mine. My wife and I gave as a middle name to our son the name Day after Dorothy Day. So pray for her intercession, but continue praying and good thoughts that not only that her cause for canonization might go through, but that more people might be converted to being in
Sure.
solidarity with the poor and with those in greatest need.
All right, I want to get to that because one of the biggest talking points that he had delivered message after message at the Vatican over the last few months, especially after Trump got elected, is the whole mass deportation thing. And I think we can all agree we don't want the violent illegals here, but is it surprising that he dipped into the politics the way he did?
That's it was part of his style. So remember a few minutes ago I was saying that different popes have different styles, and you know, I think that the last three popes, the ones that we've mentioned, have all in their various ways done this. So I'm thinking about if we think about the spring of 2003, so those sort of heady days right before the United States entered that war in Iraq and that invasion. And if you recall, President George W. Bush was summoned to Rome. He made a trip to Rome for a private meeting with Pope John Paul II, who at that point was very ill. In his last 5 years or so, John Paul II had really been slowed by Parkinson's and other ailments. And yet, John Paul II made a forceful message for peace. He said, this war that you're contemplating right now, the criteria for a just war are not being met. So if you do this, it's going to be an unjust war. And of course, we know that President Bush disregarded that. Nevertheless, that was John Paul II inserting himself in a political moment. I think sometimes we have a problem in the United States and at other places throughout the world. When we hear the word politics, we think, oh, partisan. We think of, okay, here comes another Trump Biden debate.
Sure.
No, that's not
Sure.
what we're talking about. Politics comes from the word polis, which means the people, the city. So Christianity and all faith traditions, in fact, should be political by their very nature because they have to do with the people. So Catholic social teaching, which is basically a series of documents. Modern Catholic social teaching dates back to 1891. Pope Leo XIII wrote a document called Rerum Novarum on the economy and workers' rights in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. That's a political document. Anytime the popes write about war, those are political statements. John the 23rd, he wrote a document in 1963, just a few months before he died, called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, in response to the Cold War. And that's well, the Cuban Missile Crisis is just in that time, and that's a political document. Pope Francis writing Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home. That's a political document. We know that all these things are political, but even Pope Benedict wrote about solidarity in a political way. So I think it's a good thing for popes to enter the political fray because they're world leaders. If we looked at them and said, oh, he's just a spiritual leader and he's just going to pray, well, that's nice. And it's good to have prayers, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago. But if that's not accompanied by action and by political movements towards justice, then the Pope is in a lot of ways abdicating his responsibility.
All right. As much serious as he was, and by the way, I also believe that he was delivering the message I believe he thought God wanted him to deliver. I think that's a whole part of this as well, to the people. But as much of his seriousness, I love the jovial B-roll we've been seeing of him smiling everywhere he went. He had this big smile, which is not like I don't remember Pope John Paul II smiling as much, maybe in his younger years, but I was in the older part of his run, right? But Pope Francis, all I see is all his smiles, and that makes me feel good that he was a jovial pope, and that might be what we needed for this time.
Oh, I totally agree. Back in the middle of the last century, Pope John the 23rd, who I just mentioned as the author of Pacem in Terris, he actually got the nickname the Smiling Pope. And, he was Pope for a very short, or not very short, but a pretty short time, just 5 years. Everybody thought he was going to be this transitional Pope. And in fact, he called the Second Vatican Council in that period of time. So he was probably the most consequential Pope of the 20th century as far as church history is concerned. But in a lot of ways, Pope Francis was very much like John the 23rd. He was always smiling, jubilant, jovial. He's the first pope that we ever saw, as far as I know, eat food on camera. He was very much. I picked up a copy of our local newspaper this morning here in Scranton, and it says on the cover, "The People's Pope." that was very much the case. He always wanted to be close to the people, and him having a sort of a jovial nature, I think, made it easier for him to do that. But it's even taken up. Before, I was talking about him being a pope of firsts. Another first that he did was he was the first pope not to live in the apostolic palace in hundreds of years. He lived in those hotel rooms in the guest house Casa Santa Marta on the Vatican property, where, in point of fact, the cardinals will be staying as they arrive in Rome here in the coming
Well,
days.
I don't remember them ever having to seal up an apartment of the Pope. That's how down to earth he was, so he lived in an apartment basically while he was the Pope. It's pretty down to earth if you ask me, and pretty
Well,
grounded.
well, in fact, they always, canon law says it has to be sealed up, but that might have been one of the first times. That's the first time I remember seeing it happen. It might have been the first time they actually recorded it happening, put it that way.
Now, there are probably some in the Catholic Church and some in the Christian circles that are worried that he was a little too progressive, or maybe making the Vatican more progressive. So where do they go from here? Are they going to try and find someone who's going to be a more inclusive Vatican, or a more, I'd say biblical, but by the book, if you will, Vatican? What are we looking at for the next type Pope?
Yeah, it's a great question. So here's what we know, that in the immediate time, Pope Francis is responsible for appointing 80% of the cardinals who will who will elect his successor. Now, they only need 67%, two-thirds, for a successful election. So as we stand here now, we have 135 cardinals who are under the age of 80 who are eligible to vote in the conclave. Two-thirds of that is 90 and change. So they need 91 votes to elect a pope. As far as my math goes, and I've tried to break down the college as much as I can, and the terms that I'm going to use are imperfect, so please forgive me, but the terms I'm going to use are liberal, conservative, and moderate. I count roughly 65 liberal and again, these terms are not perfect, 65 liberal cardinals, 49 conservative, again, quote unquote, conservative cardinals, and 21 either moderate or ambiguous, hard to determine cardinals. So even if all 21 of those cardinals voted with the liberals, they wouldn't have 91. And the conservatives would still be way off. So my sense is that whoever the successful candidate is, that there's going to be some amount of compromise there. All that aside, when Pope Francis was elected in 2013, remember, every single cardinal in that room, now there were 115 cardinals in 2013, every single cardinal in that room had been appointed either by John Paul II or Benedict XVI. And nobody would say Pope Francis, as you've rightly raised so far, Alex, nobody would say Pope Francis is sort of an ideological clone of Benedict or John Paul. And yet he himself was appointed by John Paul. So honestly, when we get in there, all bets are off, because the way that a pope acts after he's been elected may not be consistent with the way he acted before he was elected. Here's another perfect example. When Joseph Ratzinger was elected pope in 2005 and took the name Benedict XVI, he was by far and away the most well-known cardinal in the world at the time. He had been prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and had been responsible for really cracking down on a lot of more progressive theologians in the Catholic Church. And so everybody thought, oh, here comes a traditionalist. He's going to move the church back 500 years, this, that, and the other thing. Didn't do it. He was much more a pastoral figure than I think anybody was really banking on when he took office. He was open to many different groups of people and wasn't nearly as sort of radically traditionalist as I think people believed he would be. So all this is to say that the office itself, namely the office of the Pope, does something to the man who takes it. And that's kind of a mystery.
All right, you're a director of ministry at Scranton University. Watching the Pope the last 12 years, does that influence the way you run your ministry, or how do you not mirror but adapt your ministry to what he had preached, if you will?
Oh, absolutely. That I thank you for asking that question, because Pope Francis, he always said about bishops and priests, and I think you can say the same thing about lay ministers in the church as well, that they ought to have the smell of the sheep on them. In other words, if they spend a lot of time with their people, they're gonna look, walk, talk, act like their people, and smell like their people. Um, and boy, there is no better advice to a college campus minister than that, or any minister in the church, because being close to the people, loving your people, is a privilege. I mean, I love working. I have students, laughing and joking around outside my office right now, as I do every day. And I love being with them on a daily basis. I also love being with the faculty and staff. That's part of the job as well, being with the faculty and staff. I love that as well. But that is such a beautiful privilege. And what Pope Francis was getting at, not just for people like me, but for all people in ministry in the church, was really a message of love. Can you love the person who's sitting in front of you at any given time? Why? Because that's what Jesus did. Plain and simple.
Well, I was gonna ask you this: how, when people enter your ministry, right? When they come to your ministry, and how by the text are you versus real life experience? How do you make, combine both to make it a Christian life, if you will?
You just hit the nail on the head with that last part. It's always a both and. Yeah, I think it's important to be well versed in the tradition, because you can't just sort of spout off this, that, and the other thing, like it's like you're just seeing, throwing
Well,
everything at
and
the wall,
kids don't
seeing
like the
what
fire
sticks.
and brimstone anymore, it feels like, right? So you gotta have a different approach to it.
I'll never take that approach, because that approach isn't interested in converting. Our interest is in conversion, and I mean for everybody, not conversion from one religion to another, but conversion to a more faithful way of life. And the way to do that is not tell people you're going to hell. You know what I mean? So
100%. So do you find atheists and agnostics walking into your ministry and saying, "Hey, I wanna learn more"?
sometimes, sure, absolutely. And somebody like Pope Francis is a great model, because he was able to take the faith of the church and put it out in such a way, and present it in such a way that anybody could understand, and not just understand, but be attracted to it. People looked at Pope Francis, and one of the enduring images of Pope. Well, let me just point to a few enduring images of Pope Francis. Remember, the day or two after he was elected, he went to the front desk of that guest room and paid his bill, paid his hotel bill. I can relate to that, because I'll be traveling next week, and at the end of my stay, I'm going to have to go to the front desk and pay my hotel bill. I can relate to that, Pope. Um, Another enduring image was when he hugged and kissed that man who was had that terribly disfigured face early in his pontificate, and anybody who saw it was moved, maybe to tears, and saying, "What a beautiful gesture! What a humble man!" That's something that's attractive to people. You don't attract people to the gospel by giving them this or that rule. And there are rules in the church. There's a whole set of law in the church we call canon law, but that's not what attracts people. What attracts people is these images and periods of love and mercy and compassion.
I am so glad you bring this up because I feel like no matter who you are, when the Pope Mobile rolls past you, you feel this sort of aura passing by you, no matter who's in the Pope Mobile. So, what is it about the Pope that brings people to the streets of New York that wants to see the Pope pass by them? What is it? And it's been that way since I can remember, but what is it? What can you explain it?
I'm not sure that I can explain it, because I think there's something that's not tangible that's there. I think part of it is another thing that we call the Pope in the Catholic Church is the Holy Father. And it's not just a figure of speech. It's because the Pope is meant to be like a father figure, a mother figure, a revered elder in the family, somebody that we can look up to. And that's part of the reason why now we feel such a loss when Pope Francis has died, because he's somebody that we looked up to, that we felt was part of our family for the last 12 years. So that whoever the Pope is, when he visits your country, he's part of the family, and you want to welcome him. You want to sort of roll out the red carpet for him, and let him know that he's welcome, that he is your father in a sense. So I think that's why. I think that's why when he comes to New York or Philadelphia or Los Angeles or Denver or Chicago, all these places the Pope has come in the past, that's why it's such a big deal, because we are welcoming home a member of our family. And in fact, Catholics believe that the Pope, that Peter was handpicked by Jesus to be the rock of the church. Petrus means rock. Cephas was his name, means rock. He was given this name by Jesus, so that the Pope now, the successor of Peter, whoever the next Pope will be, is the rock of the church. And when we see that, we are drawn to it because that's what holds us steady, firm in our faith.
All right, I gotta ask this because over the weekend I was talking with Easter. It was Easter weekend, and by the way, I do feel like there was a power that he wanted to, despite all his health situations, he made it to Easter one more year. And my dad had some health issues around Easter in 2023 before he passed, but he made it that last Easter. I feel like there's a power to seeing your last Easter that these both of these men wanted to see it. Wanted to be there one more time. So there's a willpower to that. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not, but I think there is.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, what I'll remember most, and this is, he could have died on any day, and I would have had, very vivid memories of the Pope. But I'll certainly remember the image of him after he delivered the annual Easter blessing from the loggia overlooking St. Peter's Basilica, which we'll see again in a couple weeks when the new Pope is elected. He'll appear on in that same space where we just saw Francis 2 days ago. Um, After that blessing, he was taken down to the square and driven around one final time in the Pope Mobile. And there were two young kids, one baby and one young child who is battling cancer, who were sort of lifted towards the Pope, and he gave them his blessing. Boy, that is an image that will remain with me, really, hopefully forever,
Was
because
that the baby that actually dressed up like the Pope? Is that the one you're talking about? Because there was a baby that was actually dressed up like the Pope and handed to him, which is pretty interesting.
it passed many times, but specifically on Sunday were handed out the mobile, and he blessed them, and that was part of who he was, just wanting to be among people. Moment for me, and I think for millions of people who watched it. But the significance of him dying on Easter Monday is really very significant because Christians believe that Easter commemorates the resurrection of Christ, which is the salvation of the world. And I think that's the message that Pope Francis would want to be continued to be spread and shared.
All right, and the other thing over the weekend was I also believe that God and Jesus, yes, he died for our sins, but more so, he died for us to use the talents that he gave us. Am I right in that? Like, it's not just going by what he preached, but he gave us talents to keep going and outliving the number 33, for instance, because I'm 33 now. So I feel like there's a lot of power in not just dying for our sins, but he gave us so much more than that. Am I right?
Absolutely. Every one of us has blessings and gifts from God, whether we acknowledge a creator or not. But Christians certainly say these are gifts that come from God that we need to share with the world. And Jesus himself said, "Love one another," and that's something that we can all do, regardless of our gifts, by being present to other people, by being caring of other people. And I think that's something that Pope Francis was constantly calling us to, that we have these gifts and we have to tap them.
100%. Now, if people are listening to this and happen to be on having a kid that goes to Scranton University or about to, how can they get in touch with you and say, "Hey, I want to be part of Dr. Cosacchi's ministry"?
Well, if you're coming to the University of Scranton, check us out. We're in the DeNaples Student Center on the second floor. And I can more than happy to, share my email address with you, Alex, and you can put it out there. And I'm always happy for people to get in touch with me and swing by my office. All of us here in the campus ministry office, we have an open door policy. And we hope that as many people as possible will come by.
All right, Dan. Dr. Cosacchi, thank you so much. And one more thing, I have to ask this because you're in Scranton.
Yeah.
Did President Biden ever visit campus?
Not I've only been here for 3 years. He certainly has been to the University of Scranton. He has an honorary doctorate from here from many, many years ago. I can say that from the house where I live, I can see the childhood home where he grew up, sort of from my front porch from a distance. He visited town a couple times while I was here, but to the best of my knowledge, in the last 3 years that I've been here on campus, he hasn't come to campus.
And you say you moved there. Did you ever think that God would bring you to Scranton? Like, where were you from before that?
I'm originally from Connecticut, and no, but before I worked at the University of Scranton, I taught theology at another university here in town. And when I came for the interview here, very much was reliant on GPS to get me here because I couldn't even find northeastern Pennsylvania on a map. So I was very grateful for that opportunity, and very grateful to be here at the University of Scranton with such wonderful colleagues and students.
Well, and I get the feeling your ministry is built on love and understanding and not, all the other stuff that might happen in another ministry. You're built on a certain kind of uh love and understanding that I feel like you bring to this.
I hope so. I hope so. That's what we're here for.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kosaki. Thank you, Dan, for everything and for joining me today. And I'd love to have you back on as we
That'd
go
be great.
further in this process.
Anytime, Alex. Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks for joining the One Leg Up Network today as we honor Pope Francis.